So am I, so it's okay.
Always good, always good. Is
Um, Larissa was visiting with her parents, and she said she was going to try to usher them out of the house as quickly as possible. Um, so hopefully she'll be able to a little bit. Where do folks want to get started?
I'll start with an admission. You added a homework assignment to listen to a podcast on inequality, and I was not able to do that. So while I have done the reading, I have not done that. So.
And given what I know about how busy Jose is.
don't even ask.
All right, then let's talk about the reading.
Okay. Let's see, what do we have here? You set up to page
152. Or in the 150s, the early 150s.
I see what you're talking about.
You want me to bring you some water? Oh, I took it out. I really know this.
Okay. Let me see. Okay. Wait, we read up to page 127 last time, was it?
Yeah. The newest part was about teacher preparation.
Yeah. Well,
that was pretty fascinating. So I got a little giddy about hearing what you guys thought.
Well, the one thing I highlighted here was on page 132. I had many concerns, particularly with the notion that seemed to permeate the project's work, that good teaching looked the same in any context or cultural setting. I was also concerned that the one right way philosophy would jeopardize the chances of teachers of color or teachers of any ethnicity who did not work in the settings the assessors were familiar with. In other words, those who worked in schools not populated by middle-class white children. Of course, that resonated with me for very personal reasons, but it also made me think just in general how there's this wave of trying to find out what that one right way of teaching is and who's doing it right and what are these so-called best practices when any number of things could work for any set of students. And we can't, it's hard to drill down because every time we think we have one way of doing that one right thing, then it becomes, oh, well, maybe this is other way. And in fact, this kind of works for the kids that we thought they would have worked for.
Mm-hmm. So, are there practices that, can there still be practices that are good for all kids?
I would say so. I just think it's a different viewpoint than saying, okay, here are the best practices to use on all kids at all times, versus saying, okay, here's a plethora of things that might actually work and that have worked for the majority of the kids that we worked with. Mm-hmm. So, it's a different mindset. And unfortunately, right now, it's because we're trying to systematize and standardize too many things all at once. I find that too many people are trying to find out what that one or two, what the golden bullets, if you will, for lack of a better term, would be to get kids to work when it could be any number of things.
So this was interesting to me because as I was reading, I took notice of that passage as well, and it feels like I don't know. My question becomes then, what level is it okay to generalize with, right? Like middle-class white kids being the bigger umbrella, let's not generalize it to that. But there seems to be a movement afoot that says, here's the right way to educate kids in urban settings, or here's the right way to educate kids who are poor in urban settings, or here's the right way to educate kids who are poor of color and in urban settings. Like, are those mixes that we can get behind, or is still that suspect to me, or us? Because to me, it is suspect.
It's suspect to me. I think that the territory is, you have what we'll call the one right way, but it's broadly a search for that there's some playbook, some set of technologies that can rule out context or judgment, and that views context, relationship, situation as something that has been, people will use that as defenders of the status quo. If you want to talk about the fact that everybody's poor in a particular community, that's an excuse. And if everybody was just a good teacher, and good teacher equals one right way, then that problem would be solved. And there's a difference between that and talking about having a certain set of capacities. So I think if you wanted to try to have a broad level conversation, you'd have to have a conversation that says, look, we know that different parts of the country and different communities are different, and it's actually problematic for us to flatten a profession in a way that gives it a kind of simplistic set of guidelines or predefines exactly what good teaching looks like. At the same time, you have years and years and years and years of research that says there's a certain set of qualities and capacities that we can broadly get into that says good teachers do certain things. And that's about a certain set of their own internal qualities and skill sets and understandings of different histories and backgrounds, and their own ability to actually do certain kinds of things. And if we want to talk about a broad set of capacities that teacher programs should have, we should do that. Now you got this most recent nonsense with the Department of Education saying it's going to only upgrade teacher training programs where those students come out in their first year or two, their students do well on standardized tests, while arguing that that's a case for excellent teaching. And so I think we're having a very technocratic conversation rather than a capacity conversation.
I'm going to stop you there, because I actually think the argument could be made that that's exactly what you do if you want to be respectful of culture, right? Like, here, this is the measure by which we will judge success. We don't care what the cultural practices are that you use to get kids to be successful on that test. I mean, that's the counter argument, right? Like, sure, do what you need to do to be culturally responsive, but here's the measure of what we're going to do to, like, whatever it takes to get there, go ahead and do it.
Yeah, it's a false, what do they call that? A Hobson's choice? Possibly if you said that the measures that you're using to decide success of the teacher and what you're measuring on are relevant to that community's understanding of itself. But when you're using a test that is disconnected from that community, its understanding of itself and its own relevance, you're having a nice talking point, but you're divorcing the relationship of the community to the test itself. And so once you do that, you are kind of saying, like, you're free to do whatever you want to get to this standard, but you're ignoring that the standard itself has its own set of kind of implied values and ideas about what good teaching and learning looks like. And so I don't think you can't, it's not coherent as an argument, even though it's sexy as a delivery point if you're not paying attention.
Well, and yeah, just to be clear, that's not necessarily what I believe, but
I know.
Right? And like, I think about like Jose teaching in New York City, like, at some point you do have to get down to a measure of a system, right? And New York City is a school system, but I would argue that, like, does the test of the students in Manhattan need to be the same as the test of the students in the Bronx, or Queens, or Brooklyn? Like, knowing that those are areas that are vastly different in the cultural pockets that they contain. Like, is there one standard assessment? Is there any way to measure folks along the same kind of guidelines?
Well, even by neighborhood, there's a difference, and I mean, to that end, I don't know how we find that balance, and that's something that I think is one of those questions where, it's going to shift even within a 5-year span. So you think you have it right, and then all of a sudden the whole neighborhood changes on you. So any minute now, for example, the South Bronx could change to something that's like megaplex slash Park Slope, and we'd never know it. It becomes this like breeding ground for yuppies and hipsters and all this other stuff. And then you'll have another neighborhood that went from that to going right back to being a hood. And um, yet and still, we have to find a way to be flexible enough to say, all right, well, we have this set of needs in our neighborhood, and we have this cultural thing happening here, and how can we be more culturally responsive? And that's gonna have to deal a lot more with the how than the what, which we are concentrating far too much on right now.
So, but both of you are parents of young children. I mean, you're going to have to put your kids in school, or you don't have to, but I'm guessing that you'll both put your kids in school. What are you going to use as the barometer, as the measure? How will you know? Right? And like, I think you would prefer somebody who was nationally board certified versus someone who wasn't nationally board certified. Looking to Jose. Given what I know about his life right now. Or you're looking for like, you don't want the teacher who's got 30% passing the test, do you? Or does it not make any difference as we talk about these things?
I would say just offhand, I mean, New York City, for example, we're only now getting national board certified teachers because it wasn't a thing at all for the last 15, 20 years. Like, the people I know who are national board certified from New York are one handful, two. Um, and there was only one from New York starting last year. Assuming one from my school starting last year. It wasn't a big thing, wasn't a big deal, and everybody said, okay, well, if you do well on tests, then I guess you get recognized by the city, and if you don't, then so be it too. There were different ways to recognize them, but generally everybody was like, we don't really recognize teachers like that. It's just like, we know who the good teachers are, and that's as far as we go. Which is, it's a weird thing, that recognition thing, isn't it? Because depending on wherever you are and wherever you're teaching, you may be recognized as someone who's a teacher leader and can be relied upon and is innovative, all this other stuff, or you could just be one piece of the cog, a very well-functioning. I mean, you could be a well-functioning cog, but you will still be a cog of a system. So there's that too. I mean, for me, I'm probably just going to be looking for an environment that's safe and healthy for my child, and teachers who actually care and want to promote the child's thinking, and be more color conscious, not colorblind, but color conscious of what's going on. Because I'm hoping my child gets to go to a school that's diverse. So we'll see. I mean, if my options are there, then that's kind of what I'm going to go for.
Yeah, I mean, I'm torn. Well, as a parent, thinking about my son who's been in many different places, and then my two young daughters. A lot of what Jose said is what I care about. I don't have any access to. I mean, I guess I could really dive in and do homework to find out about their teachers, but the things I care about are the school as a culture and the teachers as a culture. Does it seem like there's, in my language, the right amount of challenge and the right amount of support? Do they kind of see Christopher enough? I don't need them to totally understand him. And are they kind of making his world bigger within whatever that subject area is? If those are kind of the basic parameters, it's okay. And even now, like, Christopher is at the public high school, and he's got, 5 of his 7 teachers he thinks are amazing. And on kind of parent-teacher conference day, I'd have a similar gut level assessment. Although one of the teachers he doesn't think is great, I think is actually pretty good. They're just not as exciting personality. Like, they're not a kind of fun or charismatic teacher, but he's actually learning a lot.
High school's hard, man.
But I'm not actually stuck on the teachers. Like, and I think I like in the article the reference to ganas, which is this idea about the desire and ability to learn. Like, to me, I don't really worry about Christopher because he has that already, and he's very consciously navigating. That's a set of privileges. It's partly about him being surrounded in my life and what he's been exposed to, but he's very clear about times in which he's at school getting fired up with his total passion and when he's just checking off some checklist to navigate society. And he's really self-motivated around handling his business around those kinds of things. And he's intellectually awake. Like, he's paying attention, he's asking questions, he's writing with his own voice. He'll choose to get a B or a C on a paper to write with his voice. Like, these are the hallmarks as a parent for me that I care about. He knows enough to write the way he wants to write and sacrifice getting a grade to please his teacher than to jump the hoops, which is not what I did as a student. So these are for me, that's what I kind of care about. At a broader level, I'm torn on the credentialization, partly because as a social worker with the MSW, I've watched how the credentialing and professionalization of social work has tore it in ways kind of in two. There's a way in which there's something very powerful and healthy about reclaiming that profession, especially in the age of something like TFA. And there's also something limiting. Even in the Delpit's work, some of our best teachers in our societies and communities are not people with credentials. And some of the more problematic teachers are people who have them. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean national board certified folks, but this territory, both around kind of strategy and the pragmatics about what we're saying about teaching and learning and who we're saying has wisdom and knowledge to be shared, when we professionalize, I'm torn there. I don't have an easy answer for how to navigate that.
Well, and kind of speaking about when we professionalize, I want to talk about the kind of earlier part of what we were reading for tonight, because it stuck out to me, hearing. Not hearing, I guess, but reading the explanations of the folks who had gone through the teacher preparation programs or who had dropped out of the teacher preparation programs. That was fascinating as somebody who has recently dropped out of a PhD program. Right? And hearing, again, reading what Delpit talks about as the more culturally relevant practices. The narrative side of things and the pieces of safety and those and honoring and valuing the narratives of the folks who are in those teacher preparation programs, and that it just well yeah, that is what good, to me it's like, oh, that's what good teaching sounds like, right? Like, that was what my classroom was based on, not necessarily because I thought, oh, let me alter this for the African American students in my class. But more because it was like, I think we'll be better when we function as a community, right? Like, that I didn't do it as a piece of kind of racial competency, but I did it as a thing that felt like the most comfortable for the students, or that I got reactions from the students as being comfortable. And so it was difficult for me because I was like, but I was white and I was doing this, and Delpit is framing it as something that is more rooted in racial competencies and cultural competencies. What'd y'all think of that?
Something recently shared with me, which maybe provides an interesting way to think about it. I'm still processing it. I had a conversation with someone talking about two routes of action. They were actually talking about ideas work, but I think maybe it has an interesting application here. So you have a root song that is around kind of fierce kind of humanitarianism or kind of hospitality, maybe even almost a kind of spiritual tradition, which at a kind of surface level, may have a kind of simplistic, like, we're all the same, but on a deep level, you have, folks like Ron Scott in Detroit talking about kind of, or Grace Lee Boggs, what does it mean to be human, and a way of thinking about how we pay attention in our awareness of each other, which can provide a tremendous set of skills. You might think about it as kind of like a Zen beginner's mind to showing up to teaching. And then the other root song is one that's really a root song around kind of justice and equity. And in that experience, we can have a kind of superficial level, which is kind of like, think about kind of early on, people taking classes around power and privilege and race, and the kind of intellectualizing and kind of oversimplifying of the isms or kind of ways they do that. And at a deep level, you've got people who, Zach, you and I aren't a part of. In our bones, in the marrow of our bones, we don't understand the experience of slavery and the way that some of our brothers and sisters and friends might. And no amount of depth of consciousness or understanding can fully trigger how a black mom wakes up in the middle of the night thinking about the treatment of her son by the police. We can begin to incorporate and empathize with that understanding. We can think about how to raise our children knowing that those conversations are happening with them, but it's very hard to get all the way kind of in the bones of that. When you take those two root strands and you can think about the ways they might harmonize together and where there might be distinctions, you've got some behaviors that could show up in whether it's classroom teaching or school leadership or running an organization or a network, and which you have very similar connections and bonds and approaches to how we care for each other in community, and where you have also very fraught potential tensions based on the level of simplicity versus depth and people's awareness of those two different ways of showing up. And functionally, maybe you're getting there from a, I don't know if this is true or not, but from a kind of Zen beginner's mind, community kind of ethic, and Delpit's getting there from a deep sense of her own kind of cultural and racial kind of consciousness and some of the root strands of those traditions. And functionally, they're maybe not that far apart, even though you might be getting there from different directions.
Okay.
I don't know. Just putting it out there.
It was pretty good. Oh, where did it go? I had a quote I wanted to draw our attention to. I did a lot of highlighting on this chapter. Oh, that is wrong. You guys talk while I look for what I want to talk about.
Okay, so I actually want to go back a little bit to the professionalization point.
Yeah.
There was an article that came out today by a good
The
friend,
what, I'm sorry?
Melissa, and there was an article that came out today on Crooks and Liars by good friend Melinda Anderson, and she mentioned that since the National Teacher of the Year award was born, only 2 teachers of color have crossed the threshold of being called National Teachers of the Year, which speaks to this point that maybe Lisa Delpit is also getting to, the fact that professionalization does often mean that there's a subjective eye as to what it means to be professional, and there are cultural and racial and frankly gender-based and intersectional uh, reasons why or why not somebody may be called a professional. Um, so to that end, I guess that's kind of what that kind of reminded me of, Scott, when you mentioned that. I was like, oh yeah, like there's all these barriers as to why somebody may or may not be doing X, Y, and Z. Even this national board business is a little weird for me, because what national board intelligently did was their New York City recruiter happens to be a black woman by the name of Genevieve Dubois. So um, her her being the face of the national board kind of changes the conversation from, well, maybe it's not just for um, you know I guess white middle class men entering into the teaching profession, but it's for everybody and anybody who wants to join. um, and of course that's it. There's one thing for it
Is
to
that what
be,
you found to be true?
well, um, okay, so here's the thing too. It did, I come from a lens of Center for Teaching Quality, which has a diverse set of folk who are national board certified. But everybody who I spoke to who wasn't involved, I mean, I'm I am an outlier in that respect. But people who I've spoken to about national board, like either what is national board, or it doesn't matter in New York City, or it's mainly for folk who are into that sort of thing, and it happened to be that the people who were applying for national board, were of a certain race, frankly, and that's kind of the way it worked. Um, the three examples I had just offhand, no, excuse me, two of them would be the teacher who did it in my building. She's a black woman, and then the person who was starting here in New York City, which is Genevieve. Everybody else has been a white male, frankly, or a white female.
So
So
let me
I
ask
think
you
that
though,
speaks volumes.
like, so that's the perception of like who is this for, from the
Yes.
like, do I sign up or do I go through this process? As you're going through the process and as you're completing the certification process, are there moments where you look at the materials or you look at the questions or you look at the tasks and say, well, where you also feel that it is aligned for that kind of white middle class male?
I, the thing is, for me, it's like perhaps, and again, this is just me. Like for one, I do feel like it's a little too difficult. Um, just it's painstaking. It's like okay, there's a lot of redundancy there. Um, But no, I don't really have that perception anymore. Only because it's like, okay, well, if they can do it, I think I can do it too, and I should be allowed in this, in this small circle of folks who've gone through this. But I don't think any longer have that perception about um, what I see as nationally board certified.
So is it
It's a little different now.
so is it a threshold problem? And I want to tie it back to what Delpit is talking about too, right? Like she's talking about how do we recruit teachers, people of color, to become teachers of color. And is it a threshold by looking around and saying, wow, all of my teachers are white, so this isn't really something that people who look like me do. And then perhaps once the threshold is crossed, then there's perception of like, no, I got this. That is possible, or
Seeing is believing. Is that what they say? I'm not sure if that's always an appropriate statement, but I do feel like the more that, for example, that I get out there, the more that people have said, "Oh, I became a teacher because you became a teacher," and I have friends who are very much in that line too. It's like, "Oh, well, you're a teacher. Wow, you're doing all these things, and you got these many degrees, and you did all this and that. I want to become a teacher because of you," and and of course, this is me sitting here with two teachers of color who I've looked up to, and I'm like, and this being my fiance and one of my better friends of the family, they're sitting right across from me, um, and they can't they're not really listening here, but
I wouldn't listen to
yeah,
us either.
I appreciate that. I was basically so. I mean, they had students who were inspired to become teachers because they were in the classroom, and that's not always the case. So perhaps it is about that, that visual representation, that model, and then trying to find a pathway for that to become a reality.
Is the closest that white teachers can get to that seeing the potential of being a great teacher in their students of color and trying to coax, like, I mean, I could never in front of a student be a teacher of color, so is the next best thing for me to make, like, couldn't do it. um, is that perhaps a focus that we should look at that we aren't, like, because we aren't talking about that, right? Like, there is no movement that would be super easy, and Scott points out in the chat that 79% of teachers in the U.S. are white women. What if there was a movement that said, all right, all of you white ladies, let's focus on finding the best possible teachers in your classrooms, and pushing them forward with a mindfulness of purposefully selecting and pushing students of color.
I would just say that I think being as great as possible for your students is the second best thing you can do. Obviously, because of the lack of teachers of color that I perceived, um, it was the reason I became a teacher is because of all the great teachers who I did have who weren't necessarily of color. At the time that I went through my schooling in the Lower East Side, um, my pre-K through 6 experience was white Jewish women, so, and they were pretty darn good as far as I'm concerned. Um, until I became, I guess, a Catholic school prodigy. That was also a different experience, but generally most of my teachers were white, and but the ones who were great are the reason why I'm standing here, and the people who weren't as good gave me fodder for my books. So there's that as well. Um,
All sorts of inspiration going on there.
exactly.
I want to, Scott. I don't want to cut you off, Scott, but
No, I'm stewing with it. Like I'm thinking like four different thoughts at the same time. Like if Jose and Renee Moore and a bunch of folks were to throw down, I like Renee Moore a lot. If you were to you know try to take the teacher certification stuff and you looked at it and said like if you just could rewrite it in a way, I have a kind of provocative question, which is like I really hear you on feeling like as you go through it, there's a sense not only like if other people can do it, I can, but also that as you dig into it, like you feel like there's room for your knowing and ways and style and voice to kind of move through the process, even if it's kind of redundant and maybe a little thing. And then I have the flip side question, which is how is it reflective of not just like you and Renee, just picking the two of you out, but if we took all of the characters in Delpit's book, for instance, including these, kind of wise Alaskan natives, and said, take your cultural knowing and understanding and develop this board certification. Like what would those attributes and qualities be like, and how would the process of moving through that to certification be different, or would they even come to a place of accepting that certification was the right way to move? Would part of the knowing be that that's actually not right? And I'm kind of chewing on that, and then part of me wonders if that's a distraction in my brain, and the other part of me saying, okay, like if we took seriously the reality of the really kind of clear dynamic of 79% of white women and an ongoing pattern of universities pouring lots of money and trying to recruit students of color to be teachers, a kind of national sense that that's something to pay attention to. There's a reason that we kind of care about it because we understand the benefits from a research standpoint about when someone who looks like you is teaching and they're a good teacher, what it can do for you, not in a kind of tokenizing way, but in a sense of being able to see a future for yourself in that role and valuing teaching as a important thing to do. What's actually in the way from that, or what is the history and how does it get changed? And I immediately go to thinking about the design of school and its function in society and what it's been, and really believe we're at a transition turning point in which we could shape a different future for the purpose of school. But school has had a long time assimilative effect, and it has had a kind of middle class white purpose in a lot of functions, and there's a way to interrupt that or change that. But I feel like the 79% of white women teachers is a symptom of that design, less the thing causing it. And I wonder how we would think really like concretely, like if we had to throw down 5 proposals and say, here's the moves we'd make, taking in Delpit's writing and our own instincts and thoughts or backgrounds, like what would we try to do to actually create a change here?
okay. Two pieces of that. Like I really like the structural piece of it too. Like who got to be a teacher when we started this whole public school idea? Like who was invited and allowed in, and what was it the best choice for? And look, we have a system that perpetuates the initial foundings of it. I think that's a really good point. There was an interview today that I read with Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot. And it's wonderful because I think she's wonderful, and I love reading her and listening to her talk, and sometimes I just listen to her on YouTube. But it was about where does she come? Please, thanks, Scott. It's hard to read the chat and
No,
think about
do
ideas.
it. Keep talking, and then just later.
But it's talking about where does she come from, and she's talking about her parents, and both of her parents kind of were pushed against what was possible, and so I think it was her mother who applied to medical school and sat down and was brought in, and we reviewed your application. It was fantastic. The problem is we allowed an African American in some years ago, and they dropped out because they got tuberculosis. And so that was why her mother didn't get into medical school. And that while things are admittedly still horrible as far as what that looks like in terms of the law and medicine and all those pieces, is there an argument to be made that some of that ceiling has been lifted, and so that teaching isn't the only job anymore? Like, are we suffering from an increase of opportunity?
Taking the recent events of the Clippers owner and not so much the owner himself, but the expression, the social expression it allows, because I don't really want to get stuck on Donald Sterling, but
yes, let's please not.
I think if you take whether it's Cliven Bundy or that, or you could look at President Obama in 8 years, but like, you have, each of those are opportunities of kind of cultural expression for people to kind of take what's brewing, right? Trayvon, Troy Davis, like you can make a list of moments in which and also ones that don't get noticed, right? There was a young woman outside of Detroit who got shot for knocking on her neighbor's door for help, and she was a young African American woman, but it didn't hit the national headlines, so there wasn't the same amount of attention to it. You can line all those up. Every chance that there gets to be a kind of boiled attention and people turn their gaze, you can see the kind of surface level tensions. And what I'd say is that while structurally, and this would be like the Supreme Court, if I was arguing affirmative action for the Supreme Court, which just went down, right, 2 weeks ago, people can argue on a structural basis that the numbers line up to say somehow we are at a point that's a kind of even playing field, or, you know, if you want to kind of view.
To be clear, I'm not saying there is an even playing field.
No, I know, but I think when you look at, is there increased opportunity for people, you know, broadly, and you'd say, well, yes and no. On some level, yes. On another hand, like, it's the highest inequality in the U.S. since 1920, right? Can people expand past their kind of their initial sense of like growing up and feeling like you have to be an apprentice in whatever trade you're in, or you're kind of classed into a certain thing, whether it's because of race or social class? Like, I think you could argue yes. On the other hand, you'd say, as cultural attitudes and ideas have changed, there's also a lot of implicit and institutional structures and barriers and internalized and externalized things going on that I'd say not so much. Like, I don't know, like, we could do like, you know, 50 years later from, you know, Brown and the civil rights movement till now and look at what's happening in the country, and I think we'd be pretty amazed at how not different things are. On lots of different indicators, but our feeling about ourselves may be different, and certainly there are some changes. Someone named Barack Hussein Obama got elected president. That, I mean, there are notable differences, but I don't know that they're as widespread structurally as we might think they are.
I wonder though, because I mean, in using the president's election as a key piece of it, like, how many kids looked at that and said, now I can be governor, versus how many kids looked at that and said, now I can be a social studies teacher? Does that? I guess that's more what I'm talking about. Like, we still suffer from a lack of sexiness in the profession, right?
That's
There's a
interesting.
lack of
Yeah, no, that's it. That's yeah. No, I get that.
like
That
the movement that we make.
across any kind of racial or cultural dynamic, the idea of being a teacher in the public school system. Now you might want to be like a superhero teacher that could be like waiting for Superman and
Right.
go save a city or something. Or but sorry, Jose, I couldn't resist. But you're right. Like there's not this kind of
If I'm going to fight through cultural barriers to become a success in whatever the profession is I choose, it doesn't
Teaching's
look
not
super
hard.
sexy to fight through those barriers to become a teacher.
yeah.
Jose, do you want to talk, or is it just nodding and head shaking from here on out?
Well, I had to only because I'm mute and unmute for different reasons. I'm actually looking at page 138, and this goes right back to it. I mean, the issues of assessing teachers are analogous to the problems of assessing preachers, whereas many thoughtful educators and educational researchers are in agreement that students are diverse in their culturally influenced learning styles, interactional patterns, and speech styles. There's much less discussion about culturally influenced the differences amongst teachers. This diversity means that the actions of teachers who differ in worldview from those who seek to assess them can lead to misinterpretations about competence, quality, and intent. So, and of course, this goes right back to Scott's point. It seems to me that we're gonna have to find ways um, to inject a little bit of that cultural responsiveness into the ways in which we assess, hire, and retain people who may be different from whatever the mainstream calls for. Um, and this is it's gonna have like we got to do major reconstruction of our institutional practices in order to do so. Because there are people, for example, who say, oh, but these tests don't actually test for race, they don't test for class, they don't test for all these things, and yet very reliably you can predict who's going to do well just without even looking at the actual student, just knowing what their income level is or what their race is or what their class is or whatever. Even if you break down Asian groups, I mean, if you look at Asian groups, there are some who come from different cultural backgrounds, and the ones who come from a certain set of cultural backgrounds may not do as well as ones that do from another cultural background. So, even people who say, "Oh, but Asians do well; they're the minority." A lot of my Asian friends are like, "Not quite." It really depends on where you're coming from. So, to that end, it makes me think that perhaps we need to find ways that to create, for lack of a better word, rubrics, or even just ways in which we can inject a little bit more, I guess, culture and race and understanding, and not necessarily have to call it watering down for certain people. It just has to be more responsive to what's going on.
What about the idea of status? The status of the profession as pieces move.
I would just say that with status, that's a real interesting piece, and it's a nice piece to talk about, because I think that just goes for everybody. I mean, if you're in a woman-dominated profession and women aren't getting paid as high as men are, then the whole teaching profession suffers because women aren't getting paid high. That means that teachers aren't getting paid high, and vice versa. But then there's also the piece of, okay, well, if I don't get paid well, then I need to make sure that I can provide for X, Y, and Z. A lot of us come from backgrounds that don't have a foundation already, like a monetary foundation. So if there was some sort of foundation in our homes, then we may feel more comfortable to go to the teaching profession. But others of us don't come from those backgrounds, so we feel like, oh, we have to do more, we have to do extra in order to pay back whatever it is that we have to pay back in loans or whatever it is, plus give money to our families, plus it's a lot of things that may not come into play for what I guess we would consider mainstream families, where it's like, oh, well, if you want to be a teacher, that's fine, and we'll try to supplement you the first couple of years. That wasn't a reality for a lot of us, including myself.
I don't know if you guys are familiar with Seth Godin's writing at all. Are either of you a little bit?
Yeah.
Um, I see real strengths and limits in his writing as it relates to these things, but I'm intrigued by the idea of, in the sense of reclaiming the profession or thinking about status. If you buy the idea that we're in the era of the kind of the knowledge worker, you create value by your ability to kind of relate, make sense of, and help people kind of navigate a rapidly changing world, and that creates a certain amount of kind of almost entrepreneurial kind of spirit and quality. You're having to make sense of new inputs all the time. So if we looked at teaching 40 years ago, teachers were still very much the provider of content expertise. You were the internet teacher. I was right. Like that was, you were going there to find out things that you can't look up on the Khan Academy's website and get someone.
And your classroom was Facebook.
Right, right, and it's not that, and then you have all kinds of divides about who's got access to those technologies and who's on them and these kinds of things. But we've also got kids growing up in a very different world. If we wanted to reclaim the profession of teachers, and teachers were to be the lead of that, they were to say, we are the ones providing value in our communities, and we know that it doesn't matter whether it's Secretary Duncan or whether it's some other kind of leaders tearing down teachers or trying to kind of turn us into a technology. There is absolute value in having human beings help raise and nurture young people with a certain set of skills, and we're going to demand of ourselves in our unions, in our boards, in our schools, that we raise the game and illuminate by agreeing on some, in a sense, it sounds terrible to say it, but a kind of common core set of qualities, less about specific content, but there's a certain set of ways we're going to hold ourselves to that standard. That if you did that, knowing it's got to be responsive or adaptive, and you build it. I'm thinking about a particular piece by a guy, Paul Tritter, in Boston, who Zach knows, who did a really great job writing up a professional learning a center, a lab for professional learning center for teachers in the Boston public school system, and it set out a set of assumptions about the qualities of teachers' wisdom, insight, their need to be learners, the conditions that they should be treated with, the dignity they should treat themselves with, and I wonder how we could foster that kind of climate that would allow for, in a sense, the differences between the Baptist minister and the way Delpit points out the differences in ministers. It kind of says we understand that's part of our profession, and we're going to build some kind of structures that re-own that, put that forward, but not wait for someone else to come solve it. I don't know where that's happening at in a way that's powerful or owned, and am intrigued to think about how it would look like concretely, thinking about the size and scale of this kind of giant system that we're in.
Well,
they would have it not get watered down completely.
it's happening on a small scale, though, right? Like, I think it is happening.
It's happening in little pools and pockets and networks all over the place, for sure.
Right, and maybe that's where it has to happen, right? Like, I think we've been coaxed into this belief that we need some sort of large scale, or that we need some sort of statewide, or we need some sort of regional or national piece of that. But my experience is that as soon as you go too big, then you lose the effectiveness of it, right? As soon as you say this is what we're going to do for everybody, then it's not quite as helpful for anybody. And so maybe the pockets are helpful, and what we need to do is not connect those pockets, but help foster more of them. We'll all just sit and think about that for a second.
You wouldn't have made a good salvationist minister, Zach, because you just gave up the saving everybody ethic all in one. The Daniel Quinn in me would say that that's right, that the rejection of one right way, walking away from a certain systemic view, and building pockets. And another part of me would say, like, yeah, but, like, if those pockets exist, but there are huge gaps between them, And if those pockets have some inherent knowing that, and community after community is living through an experience of the system itself, there's a certain amount the local community can do and a certain amount the leaders and districts can do, and we can point to all kinds of examples. But the broad brush would say the overall system understanding, system mind, national discourse, national policy has huge amounts of impact for the majority of people living inside of that system. And that not connecting them, not finding some linkages and putting forward some powerful proposals is pretty limiting, and ends up being that you have these great little small pockets that have always existed, but you don't get any larger kind of traction, and that there's a kind of call to action to do something, to put something on the table rather than just live in the small pools.
Well, maybe the call to action is for that pocket that's doing it really well, that is helping and connecting and building community, is that they tell their story to these folks over here who don't have that pocket, and they don't say, we want to do what they're doing,
Right.
but they say, we want to be what they are, right? We want to have the experience of this, but on our own terms.
Mm-hmm.
Because Delpit, when she's doing the quotations of the African American and the Alaskan Native folks and about sitting in class, I think to myself, like, yeah, I was pretty good at the testing, right? I knew, like, you show up and you do the study and you listen to what the teacher is saying, and then you complete the essay or the test at the end, and you do well, and you are successful. And I was good at it, but when I think about was I enjoying it, my answer is no, right? Like, there's this person, like, I wanted her to turn to the white kids next and be like, are you having a good time? Because my guess would be no, probably not having a good time. Just better at playing the game, or came to the game knowing the rules.
So flip the question from really big to really small. So you have a couple of people in your circle or sphere, and they come talk to you because they're thinking about being teachers. And they want some recommendations about programs they might study in, books they might read to help them think about being a teacher, whether or not it's a good profession to enter because they know that so many teachers leave after their first 5 years. Taking in Delpit and your own stuff, like, what's your advice to them?
Yeah, Jose, what's your advice?
Sit down.
I think, well, see, this is the thing, right? I often am just like, yes, you can be a teacher, but here are some things I'd like you to know. And it ends up being one of those sit-downs that's like, okay, if you can do X, Y, and Z, here are some variables I want you to consider before you do so. Because I think one of the worst things that could happen is if I do, and of course this is me being all, I guess, grandiose, if I do invite someone into the teaching profession, I wouldn't want them to feel like once they come in that they need to leave immediately because it wasn't exactly what they expected. Versus if I said, well, here are some things I want you to think about, and let me just switch your mentality a bit about what's going on, then it becomes a different conversation. So those are some things that's kind of the framework that I work with. It's like, okay, well, yes, and here are some things I'd like you to know.
Would you say, like, not all of them, but one or two or three of the things that, like, are on the top of that playlist of what you think people gotta know?
Generally, I always start with, well, what are your finances like, to be honest?
Yeah.
Because if you're like foot deep in loans and you're trying to get an apartment in New York City, then it's going to be a bit of a struggle for you. And that's the reality until you get your master's, and even then you'll get maybe like a $13K jump, if that, and
And you're
you still
another
have to
foot
pay
deep.
off. Yeah, by the time that you actually do get it, then it becomes another foot worth of debt, if you will. But the second one is generally like a sense of attitude. Kind of want to find out what their angle is when they do talk about the teaching profession, and that goes with everybody. In fact, like I had one teacher, and again, I guess this is a white female teacher. Like I asked her sometime within her first, second year, I asked her, so do you see yourself as a lifelong educator? She's like, yeah, I mean, we'll see. I could become, a lawyer at any given minute, and that'll be that. And I was like, oh, okay, so that's where your head is at, which is why I had to take care of a lot of her difficult kids. Um, but I didn't really get it too deep into that. I was like, you know what, I'll just let this rock for now. Whereas a couple of other kids, and again, it really depends too, because some students will come in and say, oh, well, I kind of want to be a teacher, but I'm gonna keep my options open. And then it's like, no, you may actually just want to be a teacher, and you're just afraid to say it full on. So there is that angle too. Then
Oh no! I bet that last one was the best one.
I was feeling that. That's why I got dropped. It always happens. The richest possible moment.
Can I tell you mine?
Yeah.
Um, the piece I start with is be willing to leave, but not be willing to leave the profession, but be willing to leave a system that you find to be unhealthy, or a system that you disagree with. Largely because I've seen a lot of people who stay with unhealthy systems, or systems that do not want to change at all, with the mindset of, I will make this change happen, or I will be the oasis of good in this building. Right? Like, I will be the best teacher in the building, which is great for you and for your ego, but it's not so great for the system, right? Because then you allow for the perpetuation of that system, right? Like, if you're being judged on the standardized test scores, and your scores are great, and you get to teach the way that feels good and appropriate to the kids, then you have to be willing to walk away. Oh, Jose's on his phone again.
sorry about that. This time I have to go through my phone, so I may experience technical difficulties.
Oh no, now he's muted.
Hello?
There you are.
Okay. I was just gonna mention really quickly that the third thing I think I look for is just what their how they view their interpersonal relationships too, because let's be honest, uh, it's harder to deal with adults than children, especially if the adults were randomly pieced together based on whatever they're hiring and not necessarily thought of as a cohesive unit.
Yeah, you've got multiple iterations coming into the community.
Yep.
The thing I was saying to Phil, to try to fill the absence of Jose, was that the advice I give is the willingness to leave, not the profession, but the system, whether it's the district or the school where you are, to be willing to say, I'm not going to perpetuate something that I believe is unhealthy, and to go and move to a system, or to wait for a system, or to seek out a system that you believe to be healthy and aligned with what you want to do for kids, and that is healthy for adults as well. Because I see so many teachers who are the one-off, or the one of the few in a school, who are holding that school together, but maybe never have the hope of turning it around and changing it.
Well, yeah. Then again, it always makes me feel like, okay, well, people, there are some people who will always have the option of moving to a locale where some of these, reforms that are being, foisted upon, urban districts
there are safe havens out there somewhere, and there's some people who will have the option of doing so at a moment's notice because they fit a certain prototype or they fit a certain whatever. So that's what that kind of made me think of too. It's like there is that sense of flight that sometimes happens when a teacher becomes experienced enough because the conditions aren't right, which often aligns with, some of the, I guess, the for lack of a better word, bad things that happen within that district. So not only are teachers not getting paid well, but they don't have good working conditions, and the working conditions aren't good. So the teachers who would stay don't necessarily want to stay anymore because they can get so much better for a little less work somewhere else, and it'll be nicer, and they'll line along to their beliefs because that place will, I guess, throw the red carpet at them with all the things that they can possibly imagine with a lot less of the stress. So
would you tell them to stay in the space that's not going to change? I mean, would you tell folks to? I mean, and I feel like this is not what I'm hearing you say, but that those are the folks who then end up becoming martyrs.
I would
in some ways.
I'm gonna own my hypocrisy in the sense that I taught in the district and then left because but that I think about a lot. But I taught in the middle school that I grew up in my hometown community, and what I'm thinking about, Zach, is an interesting relationship around school connected to community and school displaced from community. And I think there are real differences in different parts of the country from how you think about those things. I wonder if your advice would be willing to leave for a while, and if it's a place that you're really committed to or is home for you, go build up the muscles or get your legs underneath of you in a system that supports you, and then go back home. But I'm thinking about like my friends Miguel and Francisco Guajardo and the work they've done in their community, in which they nurtured youth leaders and themselves, went and got degrees, got into other systems, and then came back and took back over their home school district. And I think that the connection from a place-based perspective, or thinking about even people's own ability to be mobile and leave, the advice has a certain set of limits in it, because I don't think it has to be that you become a martyr. And I see all the tensions in why your advice has some real merit to it, because it can be really overwhelming to be in a system and feel like that's how everything everywhere works, and to not know there are other places you could go that can be healthier. But there's also a limit in the sense of just kind of go wherever else you want to go, because it becomes down. One of the questions I've found most powerful, and I think it works here as well, is what's the promise you're making and how do you keep it? And I think if your promise is to a school system, it might be that you want to leave it. If your promise is to a community or a street or your neighborhood, then you're not actually working for the system. You're working for that community, right, and you're playing through that system, and maybe your supports are outside of it. So I just would kind of test that out a little bit.
And when I say system, I don't necessarily mean leaving the community, but I mean finding the school within that community that is more aligned, or finding the school within the community that is willing to change. And this comes from kind of more my experience of being in a school where that wasn't aligned with my beliefs for what was best with students, that wasn't aligned with many of the practices that I felt and believed to be right, and wasn't going to change, right? That wasn't interested in hearing any kind of, what if we tried it this way? Whether from a kind of more radical, forceful kind of punk push, or from a more kind of subversive, what if we did it this, can I try this little piece of it? Right, that the change wasn't going to happen there, and that there was more detriment to me staying, right? Because there's also that personal piece of like, how much are you willing to give up of yourself to stay with a system that is unhealthy? And the flight piece, I think, Jose, that you're talking about, I'm not necessarily saying like on Tuesday leave if things were bad on Monday, but be willing to say, I'm going to stay another year, and that year is also going to be me looking to see what the system is that can better support me and that I find reciprocity in the care that I'm giving to the students and to the community.
I think that's fair, and I would never want anybody who feel comfortable staying in a certain profession to stay there, or even to sustain that school board, whatever, or community. However, and I guess this kind of makes me think about, why do teachers of color go into the profession? More often than not, it really is to go pay it forward, to pay whatever it is that they get forward, and that may or may that may that reason seems to top a lot of the reasons why a teacher of color would go into the profession. Even someone, again, like a Renee Moore, who may have grown up somewhere else, but she found home in a place that reminds her of her own upbringing or the things that she felt passionate about. It's not, of course, from our outsider perspective, she's out of Mississippi. That's before her. If she was allowed to be more vocal, I'm sure things would change. But she isn't, so things aren't changing, and she doesn't have a collection of folks who can band together, and I guess basically she doesn't have collective bargaining. She doesn't have collective rights and all that other stuff. But more importantly, maybe that may not be the number one reason why, I guess, the quote-unquote normal teacher would or would not go into teaching. So, paying it forward is such a big deal for teachers of color. I'm not so sure if that's the case when a white teacher, for lack of, comes into an environment that's completely different from his or hers.
Mm.
So it makes me think of that, and then it makes you think, okay, so you got 4 or 5, let's say 3 to 4 years in the teaching profession, you feel like you have your wings under you. Do you leave immediately, or is it, and why is it that you left? Is it because it was just that bad of a situation, or you wanted to go back to your neighborhood? I mean, any number of reasons, and then, but then of course the kids of color, they're like, well, they're gonna leave eventually. We just need to figure out when, and just hold our breaths. So there's that perspective as well, and it's tough. It's tough for everybody involved, and it builds resentment often too. And TFA has to, bear the brunt of a lot of this because they're public enemy number one when it comes to that sort of thing. But I don't think it's a problem that's just about TFA. It's about just, it happens. Just some food for thought. I mean, I don't know. I didn't mean to set y'all up either.
No, it's good, and
That's good. That's good.
I put the idea out there because I want it to be better. It's really what you both say strikes me as true and valid, and doesn't make me want to say no to everything that I said, but makes me want to figure out the more nuanced piece of it, right? Because I think there's something in there that says stay, and then there's something in there that says, and here's when you go. Right?
Yeah. I had one other bit for me besides the kind of what's the promise you're making and how do you keep it. But what I wish someone would have said to me that didn't was that in the same way where it takes, the rule of thumb. When I got into social work, people told me it takes 10 years to be a good therapist.
Mm-hmm.
It takes 10 years to be a really skilled community organizer. It takes 10 years to be really good at social work. No one told me it takes 10 years to be a really excellent teacher. No one gave me a kind of time horizon to see the art and craft of teaching from a view of 10 years. It was very much about the signs of success, coming immediately right out of the classroom. And there was not, for me, I grew up in Arizona, there is nowhere the kind of union or depth. Like, I've learned more in the last 10 years about whole cultures of teacher as professional, teacher as artist, teacher as activists, and huge ripples that really live, I'll be really honest, like in a heavily East Coast and edges of California vibe. But like in rural Arizona, like and in Arizona as a state, like it just doesn't happen. And you know, I was taught to stare kids down like Queen Elizabeth and get proximity and get good test scores and to teach a Super 7 lesson. It was all very technical, very mechanical, and almost nothing about art and craft and depth, or even to have a sense of that, to have any anchors in it. And so the only other thing I'd offer up to people is that there are communities and resources and tools to nurture that and to see yourself in a continuum of development rather than something flat, which was not available to me at the time, something I wasn't aware of.
Gentlemen, by the way, in the interest of time, I'm sorry to do this, but my baby needs to go to sleep. But we'll talk next week, I'm sure.
Yeah. Thank you both so much.
Yes.
Yeah. Good night.
Good night, friends.
Oh, cool.
Whoa, wait, what?
Good night, folks.
Did you have something else to say?
Nah, good night.
Good night.
Night,
Thanks.
folks. Sure.